Good afternoon. I am grateful to the Rural Assembly Everywhere team for hosting this wonderful event and creating the opportunity to connect with peers, collaborators, and neighbors at such a critical moment in our nation. My name is Megan Black. I work for an organization called Faith in Action, a national network of 40 plus local organizations across 22 states who do the work of grassroots community organizing, following the leadership of clergy and community members to transform their communities into places of belonging, abundance, and dignity for all people. Our local chapters tackle issues that affect them directly through local elections and ballot campaigns, and through our national network, weigh in on issues that affect us all and for which we cultivate deep empathy and moral concern, like access to healthcare, fair wages, gun violence, immigrant rights, criminal justice reform, and other forms of racial injustice. We are called Faith in Action because we work predominantly with congregations and faith communities. Faith is central to our work. While we come from many different religious backgrounds, including many denominations of Christianity, several expressions of Judaism and Islam, and we include Native American communities and people of Baha'i, Buddhist, and Unitarian Universalist faith, we share a common belief that the communities and the world we live in can look different, can be better for everyone, that our nation as a whole can be a place in which we are united across our differences and in which everyone has been invited to sit at the table. We also find strength and guidance in our faith, which compels us to take action on behalf of our friends and family and neighbors. And finally, we recognize that so many of our neighborhoods and towns are knit together by the church or synagogue or masjid that sits on the corner. That in this country, places of faith hold the fabric of our community life together. I've been doing this work since 2011, when I moved to Kansas City, Missouri from Chicago to work for a local chapter of Faith in Action. I was only 23 years old at the time and was floored by the impact that our coalition of clergy and congregation leaders was able to have in Kansas City and across the state of Missouri. We were Lutheran, Episcopalian, Methodist, Catholic, African Methodist Episcopal, CME, Baptist, Orthodox, Jewish, and Muslim. And we came together to fight for fair wages, access to school and work for the children of immigrants, and an end to predatory lending across the state of Missouri. I grew up in Iowa in a very tight knit white Catholic community. And aside from visits to my grandparents' Black Pentecostal church in Illinois, I had not had much exposure beyond the Catholic faith before I moved to Missouri. Nor had I paid much attention to what can happen when the power of faith is moved outside of the sanctuary and into the neighborhoods in which the sanctuary sits. Seeing clergy in their collars standing outside the grocery store and the payday lending shop to collect signatures for a ballot campaign that would end predatory lending in our state forever changed my understanding of the power of faith. In fact, I was so inspired by the public witness that these clergy and faith leaders provided that I decided to go to seminary in Tennessee. From the library at my seminary in Nashville, I watched on social media as the same clergy with whom I'd worked on immigration and predatory lending and healthcare in Kansas City and in mid Missouri started to use their voices and platform to speak out on racism in law enforcement during and after the protests in Ferguson following the killing of Michael Brown. I saw this as an extraordinary exercise in transformational empathy and moral courage. Some of these clergy were, of course, immediately affected by the issue, either because they were African American or from the St. Louis area, or for some other more personal reason. Others had never spoken out before on the issue of racism or had little understanding of the fear and anger and grief that drove young people into the streets of Ferguson. But through their faith, their commitment to their community, and the relationships that they had cultivated with others in our shared community organizing work, these clergy and congregation members discovered an extraordinary well of deep empathy and moral courage. The kind of empathy that doesn't just flash across the mind, but agitates deep in the soul, compelling us to get out, take risks, and share a message of love and hope and transformation for all. I watched from that basement library at the seminary as people of faith and moral courage were learning to talk about some of our deepest and most painful social issues in public and across racial and religious difference. And I decided in that moment that seminary was great and all, but maybe the education I was looking for was back where I had come from. It didn't take me long to pack up and move back to Missouri, where I've been for several years now, working with clergy and faith leaders across the Midwest and the country to cultivate empathy for our many differences and ways to be in solidarity across them. It's been an extraordinary time to be doing this work, and not always in a good way. In this last year in particular, I have felt as close to despair about our ability to overcome our differences as I've ever been. And as a biracial Black woman who grew up in a white community in Iowa, I have felt the split very viscerally in my own being. A little more than a year ago, I drove up to Western Iowa to visit family and attend my cousin's season opening football game. They won the game, and the next day they took me to the Guthrie County Fair to watch as my cousin Rachel showed rabbits. I had a blast that weekend, but I couldn't help but notice that everywhere we went, I was usually the only person of color. Everyone was very kind and welcoming, but we studiously avoided talking about the upcoming election as the primary was in full swing, or anything else that might disrupt that equilibrium. As I was leaving the Guthrie County Fair, driving south to Missouri past the cornfields and soybean fields and grain silos, feeling good about spending time with family and having thoroughly enjoyed the fair, but a little bit disquieted by all the things that went unsaid, my friend Cedric called me from New York City. At that moment, he was leaving the Afropunk Festival in Brooklyn, the annual arts festival celebrating Black culture in all of its diverse expressions. He told me about walking past a sign at the entrance that declared no racism, no sexism, no homophobia, no Trumpism. I had a moment of internal dissonance listening to Cedric. I wondered how the Guthrie County Fair and Afropunk could exist in the same country or in the same person as I was experiencing it in that moment. I wondered what it will take to overcome the differences that were so starkly illustrated for me in that moment, and if we have what it takes. And then I remembered a pilgrimage I'd helped organize with a group of rabbis and Christian clergy from Michigan, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Arkansas, Texas, and a handful of other states. It was an event led by rabbis who saw what was happening to children at the borders of New Mexico and Texas and were determined to do something about it, even though they lived far away and the children were not their own and the experience that these children were having was so far away from their own. They remembered the scriptures, how God had delivered them from oppression and exhorted them to remember the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And following that example, decided to trek from their home states to the border and bear witness to the injustice taking place there. Along the way, they picked up more rabbis, more Christian pastors, and more people of faith, including myself. At the border, they prayed, they stood vigil, and they lobbied local and federal officials for better conditions for the children and an end to the practice of separating and containing innocent children. These were clergy from the heartland who serve small suburban and rural communities and who believe in the power of faith and community. I truly believe that these are the folks who will build a table that has a seat for everyone, a table of belonging, abundance, and dignity for all of us. And I believe that these spaces is where it happens. Thank you so much for letting me share these stories, and especially to Rural Assemblies everywhere and the team behind Rural Assemblies for this essential convening. Be well.